The roar of motorcycles broke the quiet hum of the diner, rolling in like a storm cloud across the desert night. Inside, the regulars paused mid-conversation, forks hovering over half-eaten plates, eyes flickering toward the windows, where the glow of headlights sliced through the darkness. Rachel, the young waitress behind the counter, visibly tensed, her fingers tightening around the coffee pot. "Great," she muttered. "Here we go again." Joe, the diner owner, grumbled something under his breath as he wiped down the counter, his movements slower now, his jaw clenched. He had seen this type before. The door swung open with a bang, hitting the wall so hard that the bells above it jingled violently. 7 men strode in, leather jackets, steel-toed boots, the stench of gasoline and ego clinging to them like a second skin. They weren't from around here. Their patches read, "Reaper's Sons," a name that had been whispered in the town for weeks now. Troublemakers, outlaws, the kind of men who rolled through small towns looking for fights no one wanted to give them. And tonight, they had found one. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. John Grizz Walker didn't look up. He sat alone in his booth, the same booth he always sat in, his old army jacket draped over the seat beside him, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He had earned the right to sit in peace. The bikers didn't care. Their leader, a wiry, snake-eyed bastard named Axel, scanned the room before locking his gaze onto Grizz. He grinned, nudging the man beside him. "Well, would you look at that? An old-timer still playing soldier." The laughter that followed was forced, but loud enough to fill the diner. Grizz didn't flinch, didn't react. He just took another sip of coffee, slow and deliberate. That was the first mistake Axel made, thinking silence was weakness. Axel strutted forward, knocking against the table with his knuckles, making the silverware rattle. "Hey, Gramps," he said, smirking. "You forget what century it is? They don't hand out medals for sitting around drinking coffee." The bikers chuckled, but it was nervous now. Something about the way Grizz didn't even acknowledge them was unsettling. Rachel froze behind the counter, her eyes darting between Axel and Grizz. Joe stepped forward slightly, clearing his throat. "Axel, maybe you should—" "Shut up, Joe," Axel muttered, never taking his eyes off the old man. Then he made his second mistake. He reached down and snatched Grizz's army cap off the table, twirling it between his fingers like a toy. The diner went dead silent. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She knew. Joe muttered, "Oh, hell." Axel chuckled, flipping the cap in his hands. "What's this? A relic from the glory days? A souvenir?" Grizz finally moved, slow, deliberate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out an old flip phone, and dialed a number. The bikers laughed harder. "Oh no!" one of them jeered. "Is he calling the cops?" Grizz lifted the phone to his ear, his face calm, unreadable. His voice was low even. "It's Grizz. I need a favor." Then he snapped the phone shut and placed it back on the table, and went back to drinking his coffee. Axel's smirk wavered. "The hell was that?" Grizz didn't answer. Rachel took a step back. Joe's fingers tightened around the rag in his hands. Then, outside, they heard it. The low rumble of engines. Not just one or two, many. One of the bikers near the window glanced outside, and his face drained of color. Headlights flooded the parking lot, cutting through the night like fire. Then the doors of the truck swung open, and men stepped out. Not just any men, soldiers. The low rumble outside didn't stop. It grew, rolling across the diner like a coming storm. A deep-throated growl of engines built for war, not for show. The bikers stiffened, their bravado beginning to crack, their smirks wilting under the weight of something they didn't understand yet. Axel flicked his gaze toward the window, his jaw tightening as he caught sight of the shadows moving outside. The streetlights caught the gleam of black SUVs, darkened motorcycles, and something heavier, trucks built to withstand more than just a roadside scrap. Grizz didn't look up. He took another sip of his coffee, the cup steady in his grip, as if he had been expecting this all along. Rachel pressed a hand to her chest, stepping back toward the counter, her breath hitching. "Who the hell did you just call?" Axel's fingers tightened around the stolen army cap, his body tensing as the first figures stepped into the glow of the diner's neon lights. The first man through the door was big, not just in size, but in presence. He moved with the deliberate confidence of a man who had led men into battle and brought them back alive. His jacket bore a faded Special Forces patch, his boots scuffed from years of walking where most men didn't dare to tread. Behind him, more followed. Men with scarred knuckles, sharp eyes, and the kind of stillness that only came from knowing exactly how much damage they could do. Some wore leather vests with military insignias. Others carried themselves with the easy control of trained professionals. Men who had seen war and walked away from it, but never really left it behind. Holloway, the broad-shouldered Marine who had served alongside Grizz in the worst corners of the world, stepped to the front of the group. His gaze swept the diner, assessing, calculating. Then he looked at Grizz. Which ones? Axel flinched, his hand drifting toward his belt. A knife, a gun, something. But Grizz finally looked up, his weathered face calm, his eyes cold. He glanced at Axel and his men, then took his time setting his coffee cup down. These ones. Holloway nodded once. The tension in the room exploded. One of the younger bikers, his face pale, reached for his gun. Wrong move. Holloway moved faster than a man his size had any right to, his hand snapping out, gripping the biker's wrist before he could draw. With a sharp twist, the gun clattered to the floor, spinning uselessly under a booth. Axel stumbled back, eyes darting between the veterans now surrounding them. His breath was coming fast, his confidence bleeding out of him. "Look, man," he started, his voice lacking the cocky edge it had carried minutes ago. "We were just messing around. No need to..." Holloway took a slow step forward. "Then apologize." Axel hesitated. Grizz watched him, his expression unreadable. "Do it." The bikers around Axel were frozen, looking to him, waiting for a sign that they weren't completely screwed. But Axel wasn't stupid enough to miss what was happening. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and outclassed in every way possible. He licked his lips, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he forced the words out. "Sorry." Holloway tilted his head. "Louder." Axel's jaw clenched. "I said sorry, all right?" Holloway stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside, nodding toward the door. "Now get the hell out." The bikers didn't hesitate. They scrambled for the exit, pushing past one another like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Axel was the last one to go, his face twisted in rage and humiliation, but he didn't look back. The roar of their bikes filled the night as they tore out of town, engines screaming like a retreating army. Inside the diner, the silence stretched. Rachel exhaled sharply, setting the coffee pot down with shaking hands. What the hell just happened? Joe let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Grizz happened? Grizz picked up his coffee again, taking a slow sip. Holloway smirked, settling into a chair. That went well. Grizz didn't smile, didn't smirk. He just watched the road, watched the dust settle, watched the night return to what it was before. Then he spoke, his voice calm, steady. "They'll be back." Holloway nodded. "And we'll be ready." Outside, the desert wind howled, carrying the promise of a storm not yet finished. The night should have ended there. The bikers had left, humiliated, their tires kicking up clouds of dust as they tore down the highway, disappearing into the desert like ghosts of bad decisions. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the kind of silence that follows a storm. Relief, tension, the knowledge that something big had just happened and no one quite knew how to process it yet. Grizz sat back in his booth, rolling his shoulders as he picked up his coffee. Rachel was still standing behind the counter, gripping the edges like she needed to hold on to something solid. Joe wiped down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, pretending like everything was normal, like the place hadn't just turned into a war zone without a single shot fired. Holloway leaned against the jukebox, arms crossed, watching the door like he half expected someone to come back through it. "You sure they're not dumb enough to try again tonight?" Grizz exhaled through his nose, taking a slow sip. "I want to say yes." He set the cup down, his fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic. "But we both know some men don't take losing well." Duke walked in from the front of the diner, dusting off his hands. "You two might want to rethink that whole 'they learned their lesson' speech," he muttered. Grizz stiffened. "They're back?" Duke shook his head. "Not yet, but I found something you'll want to see." He motioned toward the door, and Grizz didn't hesitate. Holloway followed as they stepped out into the night, the cool desert air cutting through the lingering tension. The town was quiet, the neon diner sign buzzing faintly above them. But just outside the glow of the streetlights, down the road where the pavement met the dirt, a single bike sat abandoned, the engine still warm, the rider nowhere to be seen. Grizz's eyes narrowed. "That's not one of ours." Duke shook his head. "Nope." Holloway stepped closer, crouching down to inspect the bike. Whoever left this behind was in a hurry. He glanced up at Grizz. "Think it's a scout?" Grizz exhaled, his gaze scanning the darkness. Number, it's a warning. A flash of movement in the shadows caught his eye. Not fast, not obvious, but there. Holloway saw it too. His body tensed, hand drifting toward his belt where his knife sat. Ready. Grizz's voice was low, calm, but full of command. "Step out, now." The night held its breath. Then, slowly, a figure stepped into the light. The biker was young, too young for this life, barely past 20, his hands shaking as he raised them, his knuckles still bruised from the fight inside the diner. Rachel had called him the Kid, one of Axel's crew. He looked like he was expecting to get hit the moment he opened his mouth. Grizz didn't move. "You lost?" The Kid swallowed hard. "No," he croaked. His voice was raw, shaky. I came to warn you." Holloway let out a humorless chuckle. "That's so?" The Kid's jaw clenched. "Axel's not letting this go." Grizz already knew that, but he let the Kid keep talking. "They're meeting up with some guys outside town," he continued, glancing back at the darkness like he was afraid something might come crawling out of it. "Not just our crew, more of them. Friends from other chapters." Holloway's expression darkened. "How many?" The Kid hesitated. 20, maybe more." Joe's voice came from the doorway behind them. "Son of a bitch." Rachel stood just inside, her face pale, her hands gripping the doorframe. "They're coming back tonight?" The Kid nodded. Grizz studied him, his gaze unreadable. "And you're here because—" The Kid swallowed again. "Because I ain't dying for Axel's pride." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Grizz finally spoke. "Where are they meeting?" The Kid hesitated, then gave him an address. Holloway exchanged a glance with Grizz. "We go to them?" Grizz's voice was steady. "We don't wait for war to come knocking." The Kid let out a breath, his shoulders sagging like he had just signed his own death warrant. "I can't go back," he muttered. Holloway stepped forward, his voice firm. "Then you're staying here?" The Kid looked surprised. "Wait, you're not gonna—" Grizz's eyes didn't waver. "You had the guts to come warn us. That means something." He tilted his head toward the diner. "Rachel, get him some coffee." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. The Kid let out a shaky breath, nodding as he moved toward the door, like he still couldn't believe he wasn't dead yet. Grizz turned back to Holloway and Duke. "Let's go." Holloway's smirk was grim. Time to return the favor. The three men climbed into Holloway's truck, the weight of the night settling on their shoulders. The bikers had made one mistake tonight. They thought they could come back and finish what they started. What they didn't know was that Grizz wasn't going to wait for them to knock on his door again. This time, he was bringing the fight to them, and they wouldn't be ready. The truck moved through the night like a ghost, its engine low, steady, controlled. Holloway drove, his hands relaxed on the wheel, but his eyes sharp as they scanned the empty road. Duke sat shotgun, checking his sidearm, his fingers rolling over the grip like a man getting reacquainted with an old friend. Grizz sat in the back seat, silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His mind wasn't on the road. It was ahead of them, at the meeting place the Kid had given them. He had been in too many situations like this before, operations that started in the dead of night, men moving with the quiet certainty of war creeping in. But this wasn't some foreign battlefield. This was his town, and that made it personal. "We expecting them to be armed?" Holloway asked, not taking his eyes off the road. Grizz nodded. "They're bikers. Of course they're armed." Duke let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, but are they smart enough to know how to use what they got?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Grizz muttered. The town was far behind them now, the lights swallowed by the black emptiness of the desert. The only thing ahead was a rundown truck stop just off the highway, a perfect place for men like Axel and his crew to regroup. Grizz could see it now, just a dim glow in the distance, barely visible through the dust kicked up by the wind. As they got closer, they killed the headlights. It wasn't an order, it was instinct. They weren't just rolling in, they were hunting. Holloway slowed the truck as they reached the edge of the lot, pulling off into the brush just before the pavement ended. The truck stop was old, abandoned, its neon sign hanging crookedly, blinking weakly against the dark. There were bikes lined up outside, more than expected, and a few beat-up trucks, their engines still warm, idling softly. Duke let out a slow whistle. Damn! That's a lot of them. Grizz didn't react. He had already counted 24 men, maybe more inside, but numbers never worried him. Looks like they're waiting on something, Holloway muttered, scanning the lot. Or someone. Axel, Grizz said, voice calm. He's not the type to let his men act without him. He'll want to be here when the hammer drops. Duke exhaled sharply. Bad news for him. The three men sat in calm silence, watching, waiting. Grizz could feel it in his bones, the moment before the first shot, the last breath before the storm hit. Then the headlights of another vehicle cut through the night. A black truck, big, armored, rolled in from the other side of the lot. As it slowed, the bikers shifted, straightening, like a pack recognizing its alpha had arrived. Axel climbed out first. He wasn't laughing anymore. His face was hard, his jaw tight. He had taken a beating tonight, but his pride had taken the real damage. That's why he was back. That's why he had called in reinforcements. He wasn't just here for payback. He was here to erase what had happened. Grizz recognized that look. He had seen it on men before. Men who didn't understand that a fight wasn't over just because they wanted it to be. And every single one of those men, they had lost. Holloway leaned forward, his voice low. We making a move? Grizz took his time answering. He wasn't interested in a fair fight. Not yet, he said, watching Axel closely. Let's see what he does first. Axel stood by the truck, talking to one of his men. His body language was tense, frustrated. He was giving orders, pointing toward the road back to town. Grizz narrowed his eyes. He's not planning to sit here all night. Holloway nodded. He's getting ready to move. Duke cracked his knuckles. Then let's make sure he doesn't. The decision was made. Grizz moved first. Without a word, he opened the truck door and stepped out, his boots hitting the dirt without a sound. The others followed, moving like shadows, blending into the darkness. They closed in, creeping along the edges of the lot, using the dead gas pumps and rusted-out cars for cover. The wind carried the faint smell of gasoline and dust. No one spoke. Not Holloway, not Duke, not Grizz. There was no need. They had done this before. Axel turned suddenly, still unaware of what was creeping toward him. He barked an order to one of his men. Get the others on their bikes. We're finishing this tonight. Grizz smiled to himself. No, you're not. Then, like a switch being flipped, they struck. Holloway moved first, stepping from the shadows, his pistol raised. Nobody move! The bikers froze. Duke emerged next, his shotgun held casually, but his finger was already on the trigger. Then came Grizz. He walked forward, slow, deliberate, like a man with nothing to prove. Axel's eyes widened as he realized who was standing in front of him. His fingers twitched toward his belt, where a knife sat, waiting. Grizz shook his head, his voice low, calm. I wouldn't. Axel hesitated. Too long. Holloway closed the distance in 3 steps and grabbed Axel by the jacket, yanking him forward before slamming him against the hood of the truck. The other bikers started to reach for weapons, until they saw what was standing behind Grizz. More figures stepped from the dark. More men, more veterans. The wolves had arrived. Axel stopped struggling. His crew stood frozen, their hands half raised, caught between their pride and survival instincts. Grizz stepped closer, leaning down until he was eye level with Axel. You had your chance, he murmured. Axel swallowed hard, his breath coming fast, his cocky arrogance gone. Grizz continued, his voice dropping even lower. This ends now. The bikers didn't argue. They knew better now. One by one, they dropped their weapons, backing away from their bikes. Axel's chest heaved, his face burning with humiliation. Grizz held his gaze for a long moment before finally stepping back. Get on your bikes, he said. Get in your truck and don't come back. Axel licked his lips, his jaw tightening, but he nodded, because he knew. This wasn't a request, it was an order. The bikers scrambled for their rides, kicking up dust as they fled into the night. And this time, they didn't look back. Grizz exhaled slowly, watching the taillights vanish. Duke let out a low whistle. Damn, that was almost too easy. Holloway smirked. They were outmatched the second they rolled into town. Grizz nodded, but he wasn't thinking about the fight anymore. He was thinking about the silence that followed, and the fact that, for the first time in a long time, he finally felt at peace. The end.